It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Beatrice Sterling laughed as she tilted her crystal flute, watching the vintage champagne soak into Chloe Vance's white silk dress in front of the entire charity gala committee. The liquid was ice gold, a sharp contrast to the humid evening air of the Sterling estate's manicured gardens. The amber stain bloomed across Chloe's midsection like a spreading bruise, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the rhythmic chirping of crickets and the distant clinking of silverware. "Oh, goodness," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with a mock concern that didn't reach her cold, predatory eyes. She didn't move to help. Instead, she adjusted the heavy strand of South Sea pearls at her throat, her diamonds catching the light of the overhead chandeliers. "I suppose that's what happens when you try to stand where you don't belong, dear. You're simply in the way." Elena Thorne, standing at the matriarch's elbow, let out a sharp, jagged titter of laughter. The other committee members quickly followed suit, their collective amusement rippling through the air like a physical blow. They were the gatekeepers of high society, and they knew exactly who the target was tonight. Chloe didn't flinch. She felt the icy trail of the wine as it seeped through the silk, clinging to her skin. As a senior surgical resident, she was used to far worse fluids on her person, but the calculated malice behind this gesture was a different kind of toxin. She looked down at the ruined fabric, then up at her mother-in-law. "It's quite all right, Beatrice," she replied, her voice steady and professionally calm. "Accidents happen when the hands aren't as steady as they used to be." The smile on the older woman's face faltered, turning into a thin, white line of fury. She stepped closer, the cloying, suffocating scent of her lily perfume invading Chloe's personal space. "Watch your tongue, girl. You may have tricked my son into a marriage license, but in this house, you are nothing more than a temporary guest. A charity case we allowed into the family out of a misplaced sense of pity." Chloe glanced toward the edge of the terrace. Her husband, Julian Sterling, was slumped in a wrought-iron chair, his head nodding slightly. To any other observer, he looked like a man who had enjoyed too much of the party's open bar. But Chloe saw the telltale signs, the pinpoint pupils, the slackness of his jaw, the grayish tint to his skin. He was drugged. Again. Her heart twisted with a familiar mix of protective rage and clinical precision. Beatrice had been keeping him compliant for months, using a rotating cocktail of benzodiazepines to ensure the Sterling legacy remained under her thumb. "Julian doesn't look well," Chloe said, her eyes narrowing. "He needs to go inside." "Julian is fine," Beatrice snapped, her voice rising just enough for the surrounding guests to turn their heads. "He's finally relaxed, which is a miracle considering the stress of your constant social climbing. In fact, since you've already ruined that dress, why don't you make yourself useful? The catering staff is short-handed in the West Wing. Run along and fetch a fresh tray of the Wagyu tartare for the senator." Another ripple of snickering went through the group. Elena Thorne leaned in, her eyes gleaming with spite. "Do be a dear, Chloe. We'd hate for the service to be as lackluster as your pedigree." Chloe felt the weight of the phone in her clutch. It was a heavy, reassuring presence. On the screen, hidden behind a triple-encrypted firewall, was a notification that had arrived 10 minutes ago. Vance Holdings, acquisition of Sterling estate debt, finalized. Beatrice Sterling didn't realize she was currently standing on property owned by the woman she was trying to treat like a waitress. "I'm not a member of the catering staff, Beatrice," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a level that was dangerously quiet. "You're whatever I tell you to be as long as you're under my roof," the matriarch hissed, leaning in so close that her pearls brushed against Chloe's stained shoulder. "Don't forget who provides the air you breathe. One word from me, and your residency at the hospital vanishes. I have friends on the board who find your presence untidy." Chloe took a slow, deliberate breath. She reached into her bag, her fingers brushing against a small, silver thumb drive, the digital key to the Sterling family's darkest financial secrets, gifted to her by Marcus Sterling just an hour prior. Marcus was watching from the shadows of the stone archway, his face a mask of stoic resolve. He gave her a single, sharp nod. The sleeping lion was wide awake now. "I think you've had enough champagne for one night," Chloe said, her gaze shifting from Beatrice to the stunned committee members. She didn't raise her voice, but the authority in it made Alina Thorne take a reflexive step back. "And I think you've vastly underestimated who is providing the air in this room." Beatrice let out a harsh, guttural laugh. "Is that a threat? From a girl who grew up in a 3-bedroom ranch in the suburbs? You're pathetic." She turned to the crowd, raising her empty glass. "Everyone, I apologize for the help. It seems the surgical department is letting in just anyone these days." Chloe didn't stay to hear the rest. She turned on her heel, the wet silk of her dress whispering against her legs. She walked past the bar, past the shimmering infinity pool, and straight toward the library. She pulled out her phone and hit a speed dial contact. "Sarah," Chloe said as soon as the line picked up. Her voice was cold, clinical, and utterly devoid of the warmth she usually reserved for her patients. "I'm here, Chloe," Sarah Jenkins replied. The lawyer's voice was sharp as a scalpel. "The paperwork is filed. Vance Holdings officially holds the deed to the estate, the winery, and the downtown offices. You are the primary creditor for every cent Beatrice Sterling spends." "Good," Chloe said, stopping in front of the massive mahogany doors of the library. She looked back at the garden, where the lights were twinkling and the laughter of the entitled echoed through the night. "She wants me to serve. Fine, let's prepare the first course. What are the orders?" Chloe's eyes went dark, reflecting the moonlight. "Call the forensic auditors. I want every account frozen by Monday morning. And Sarah, tell the security team to be ready. We're going to have a very public eviction in 3 weeks." She hung up and looked at the silver drive in her hand. Beatrice thought she was protecting a legacy. She didn't realize she was guarding a tomb, and Chloe Vance was the only one who held the keys to the exit. The game had officially begun, and the first move was a bloodbath. The following morning, the Sterling estate felt less like a home and more like a stage set waiting for the curtain to rise. Chloe Vance stood in the sun-drenched morning room, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain teacup. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of lilies, and the sharp, acidic tang of the grapefruit Beatrice Sterling insisted on having sliced every morning at precisely 7. The clatter of heels on marble signaled the antagonist's arrival before she even spoke. Beatrice swept into the room, draped in a silk robe that cost more than a surgical resident's monthly salary. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she adjusted a diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist and peered at the sideboard with a look of profound distaste. "The silver is tarnished," she said, her voice like a serrated blade. She didn't look at Chloe. "I suppose I shouldn't expect much from someone who spends her days in a public hospital, but if you're going to live under my roof while Julian recovers, you will learn the standards of this family." Chloe didn't flinch. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea, the bitter liquid grounding her. "The silver is exactly as it was yesterday, Beatrice. Perhaps the light is just hitting it differently this morning." Beatrice finally turned, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "Don't get precocious with me. You are here on sufferance, Chloe. Julian is my son, and his condition," she spat the word as if it were a personal insult, "requires a level of care and discretion you clearly lack. I've already contacted my lawyers to discuss his medical proxy. You're clearly overwhelmed." The vibration of the phone in Chloe's pocket was a silent, lethal hum. She knew what it was. Sarah Jenkins had promised the first wave of the forensic audit would hit the Sterling accounts by breakfast. "I'm not overwhelmed," Chloe said, her voice unnervingly calm. "In fact, I've never seen things more clearly. How is Julian this morning? I noticed his dosage was increased again last night." Beatrice stiffened, her hand flying to the pearls at her throat. "The doctors I hired know what they're doing. He needs rest. He doesn't need his wife whispering in his ear about surgical rotations and rehabilitation. He needs to be compliant so we can manage the estate." "Manage it?" Chloe asked, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "Or drain it. I saw Marcus Sterling in the hallway earlier. He looked concerned about the winery's recent quarterly reports." "Marcus is a child who plays at business." Beatrice snapped, her face flushing a mottled red beneath her expensive foundation. She walked over to the table and picked up a heavy silver spoon, inspecting her reflection in its bowl. "And you are an interloper. You think because you have a degree and a marriage certificate that you belong here. You're a glorified nurse who got lucky. In 3 weeks, we're hosting the Sterling Heritage Auction. It's the event of the season. I want you out of sight. Stay in the West Wing, or better yet, stay at that wretched hospital." She tossed a folded check onto the table. It slid across the mahogany surface, stopping inches from Chloe's hand. "Consider that a tip for your services as a wife this week," Beatrice sneered. "Buy yourself a dress that doesn't look like it came from a clearance rack. It's embarrassing to have you seen in the foyer." Chloe looked down at the check. It was for $5,000, a drop in the ocean compared to the millions Beatrice had been siphoning from the family trust. Chloe reached out, her fingers brushing the paper. She didn't pick it up. Instead, she pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped the screen. A notification from the Sterling private bank sat on the lock screen. Urgent. Temporary administrative hold placed on account ending in -9902. "You might want to check your own messages, Beatrice," Chloe said softly. Beatrice laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "And why would I do that? To see more of your medical updates." "No," Chloe replied, her gaze locking onto her mother-in-law's with the precision of a scalpel. "To see why your American Express Centurion card just failed its morning authorization." The room went deathly quiet. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Beatrice's sneer faltered, her brow furrowing in confusion. She reached for her phone, which sat beside her grapefruit. As she swiped, the color began to drain from her face, leaving her looking older, more haggard. "What is this?" Beatrice hissed, her fingers trembling as she scrolled. "There must be a mistake, a technical glitch." "It's no glitch," Chloe said, standing up. She felt the weight of the silver drive in her pocket, the one containing the evidence of Beatrice's drug-induced control over Julian. "It's an audit, and it's only the beginning. You have 21 days until the Heritage Auction, Beatrice. I'd suggest you start looking for a dress you can afford. Because by the time the first item goes under the hammer, you won't even own the chair you're sitting in." Chloe turned and walked toward the door, her heels clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the marble. She didn't look back to see the look of mounting panic on Beatrice's face. She had work to do, and the first person she needed to see was Marcus. The countdown had begun, and the Sterling legacy was about to be dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. 2 hours after leaving the suffocating opulence of the Sterling estate, Chloe Vance stood in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor of the hospital's private laboratory. The scent of industrial-grade bleach and sharp antiseptic was a welcome palate cleanser after the cloying, heavy fragrance of Beatrice's lilies. Here, in the belly of the medical wing, everything was objective. There were no family secrets that could survive a centrifuge, and no lies that could hide from a mass spectrometer. Marcus Sterling was waiting for her near the hematology station, his lab coat rumpled and his eyes rimmed with the red fatigue of a double shift. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he handed her a tablet, his fingers trembling slightly as they brushed against hers. The screen was filled with jagged graphs and chemical breakdowns that would mean nothing to a layman, but to a senior surgical resident like Chloe, they read like a confession. "It's worse than we thought," Marcus whispered, his voice echoing hollowly against the white-tiled walls. He glanced over his shoulder, the ingrained habit of a man who had spent a lifetime looking for his mother's shadow. "I ran the full panel on Julian's last 3 draws. The vitamin supplements she's been forcing on him aren't just placebos to keep him compliant. They're high-dose benzodiazepines mixed with a controlled beta blocker." Chloe scrolled through the data, her jaw tightening until it ached. She felt a cold, sharp prickle of fury beneath her skin. She had known Beatrice Sterling was a manipulator, but this was clinical betrayal. Julian wasn't just a victim of gaslighting, he was being chemically shackled. The graphs showed a steady, toxic accumulation in his system, enough to explain the tremors, the memory gaps, and the crushing lethality of the heart condition Beatrice claimed he had. She's been keeping him in a perpetual state of cognitive fog, Chloe said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. She tapped a specific spike on the screen. And this is an off-label sedative usually reserved for preoperative sedation. If he'd taken this and tried to drive, or even just walked down those marble stairs alone, he could have died. She told him his father died of the same thing, Marcus said, his face twisting with a sudden, sharp spike of resentment. She told him he was fragile, that he needed her to survive. Every time he tried to question the business or look into the heritage auction details, she'd tell him he was having an episode and give him another dose. The vibration of Marcus's phone on the metal counter sounded like a gunshot in the quiet lab. He looked at the caller ID and went pale. Without a word, he tapped the speakerphone icon. "Marcus!" Beatrice's voice was a sharp, entitled lash. She didn't ask how he was. She didn't acknowledge the hour. "I've been calling Julian for 20 minutes and he isn't answering. I suspect that girl has been whispering in his ear again. Go to his room and ensure he takes his evening dose. Double it if you have to. He needs to be completely rested for the board meeting tomorrow. I won't have him stumbling over his words when the auditors arrive." "Mother, he's already lethargic," Marcus said, his voice straining to remain neutral. "I'm worried about the respiratory depression. If I increase the dosage—" "I didn't ask for a medical opinion, Marcus," Beatrice snapped, the sound of a crystal glass clinking against a ring audible in the background. "I asked for results. Julian is the face of the Sterling legacy until the auction is finalized. If he looks weak or, heaven forbid, starts making sense, the board will panic. Do your job and keep him quiet. I have Alina Thorne coming over for tea to discuss the guest list, and I will not be interrupted by Julian's anxiety again. Am I clear?" Marcus closed his eyes, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the counter. "Perfectly clear." He ended the call, the silence that followed feeling heavy and suffocating. The rage in the room was palpable, a living thing that Chloe channeled into a singular, focused point of intent. "She's not just a bully, Marcus," Chloe said, her eyes fixed on the toxicology report. "She's a predator. She's using Julian's own body as a cage to protect her social standing." "What do we do?" Marcus asked, looking at Chloe as if seeing her for the first time, not as his brother's wife, but as the woman who held the power to burn his mother's world to the ground. "If I stop the medication, he'll go through withdrawal. If I keep giving it to him, she wins." Chloe reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted flash drive. She plugged it into the lab's terminal with a surgical precision that made Marcus blink. "We don't stop it yet. We document it. Every pill, every prescription, every command she gives you. I've already contacted Sarah Jenkins. She's filing the emergency injunction as we speak, but we need the clinical proof to make it stick. We aren't just going for an audit, Marcus. We're going for a total removal of her guardianship." She turned the screen toward him, showing him the Vance Holdings logo, the one Beatrice had mocked as a small-time accounting firm. Beneath it sat a list of the Sterling family's private medical debts, all of them recently purchased by Chloe's parent company. "She thinks she's the one holding the leash," Chloe whispered, the cold satisfaction of the hunt settling in her chest. "She thinks she can drug her way out of a financial crisis. But she forgot one thing about surgeons, Marcus. We don't just treat the symptoms. We cut out the cancer." Chloe watched the realization dawn on Marcus's face. He looked at the drive, then back at the toxicology report, the fear in his eyes slowly being replaced by a desperate, flickering hope. "The auction," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "She's banking everything on the heritage auction. She's already promised Alina and the rest of the board that the proceeds will cover the deficit." "Let her promise the moon," Chloe said, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat as she began to pack her bag. "In 48 hours, there won't be an auction. There will only be a reckoning, and Beatrice Sterling will find out exactly what happens when the person you've been stepping on finally stands up." She walked toward the exit, the lab doors swinging shut behind her with a final metallic thud. She didn't look back. She had 21 days until the auction, but only 2 days until the first board meeting. The countdown wasn't just for the money anymore. It was for Julian's life. And as Chloe stepped out into the cool night air, she felt the weight of the silver drive in her pocket, the weapon that would finally silence Beatrice's entitled demands forever. The following afternoon, the Sterling estate was a hive of frantic, high-society preparation. Chloe Vance stood at the edge of the sun-drenched conservatory, her presence as unnoticed by the catering staff as the stone gargoyles on the roof. The air here was thick with the cloying, funeral-sweet scent of stargazer lilies and the sharp tang of expensive floor wax. In the center of the room, Beatrice Sterling sat perched on a velvet settee, a crystal gin glass sweating in her hand as she tore through a stack of auction catalogs with the ferocity of a vulture. "The jade collection goes in the West Gallery," Beatrice snapped, not looking up as a servant moved a display case. "And tell the security team that if I see one person without a black tie invitation, they are to be removed by the collar. This auction isn't a charity event for the masses." Chloe watched her mother-in-law, noting the slight tremor in the older woman's fingers, the only outward sign of the financial deficit Marcus had described. To anyone else, Beatrice looked like a queen preparing for her coronation. To Chloe, she looked like a woman building a pyre. "You're early," Beatrice said, finally glancing at Chloe. Her eyes traveled down Chloe's simple professional scrubs with a sneer that could have curdled milk. "I suppose in your world, being a senior resident means you don't have to worry about looking like a functional member of society. You smell like antiseptic and failure, Chloe. It's offensive to the lilies." Chloe didn't flinch. She walked toward the fountain, the sound of her sensible shoes a dull thud against the polished marble, a stark contrast to the rhythmic, aggressive clinking of Beatrice's ice against glass. "I came to check on Julian. He wasn't in his room." "Julian is resting. He's had a difficult morning." Beatrice dismissed her with a wave of a diamond-encrusted hand. "He doesn't need a doctor right now. He needs a mother who knows how to manage his delicate constitution, something you've proven remarkably incapable of doing." A few feet away, Elena Thorne paused her inspection of a diamond necklace, her sharp eyes darting between the two women. She was a silent witness to the daily humiliations Beatrice heaped upon her son's wife, her expression one of mild, entertained pity. "I'm offering you an olive branch, Beatrice," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a level that was dangerously calm. Beatrice let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "An olive branch? From you? What could you possibly offer me that I don't already own 10 times over?" "Cancel the heritage auction," Chloe said. "Tell the board that you're stepping down for personal reasons. Use the next 24 hours to transition your affairs quietly. If you do that, I'll ensure the medical board never sees the toxicology reports Marcus and I have been compiling." The room went deathly silent. Even the caterers seemed to hold their breath. Beatrice set her glass down on a glass-topped table with a definitive asterisk clack asterisk. She stood slowly, her spine stiffening until she seemed to tower over Chloe despite their similar height. "You think you can threaten me in my own home?" Beatrice's voice was a low, venomous hiss. "You are a girl from a family that had to save for a year just to buy a used sedan. You are a guest in this life, Chloe Vance. A temporary inconvenience Julian picked up like a stray dog. You have no power, no standing, and certainly no leverage." She leaned in closer, the scent of gin and expensive perfume washing over Chloe. "I am a Sterling. I don't negotiate with the help. Tomorrow morning, I will walk into that board meeting. I will secure the funding for the deficit. And by the time the auction ends, you will be a footnote in Julian's divorce papers. Now, get out of my sight before I have security throw you onto the street where you belong." Chloe reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the cool, metallic edge of the silver drive Marcus had given her. She felt a strange sense of peace. The warning had been given. The last chance for a graceful exit had been spat upon. "I'll leave," Chloe said, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "But remember this moment, Beatrice. I tried to be kind." "Kindness is for people who can't afford to be cruel," Beatrice retorted, turning her back to return to her catalogs. As Chloe walked toward the exit, she caught Elena's gaze. The socialite looked unsettled, her brow furrowed as she watched Chloe's steady, confident stride. For the first time, the sleeping lion didn't look like she was hiding. She looked like she was hunting. Chloe stepped out into the humid evening air, the countdown in her head hitting the final 24 hours. Tomorrow was the board meeting. Tomorrow, Beatrice would find out that the estate she was so desperate to save didn't belong to the Sterlings anymore. It belonged to Vance Holding, and Chloe was the only one with the key. The evening of the Sterling Gala arrived with a suffocating sense of finality. The estate was a monument to old money and carefully curated lies, its grand ballroom draped in the signature sterling green and gold. Huge arrangements of white lilies, their scent cloying and funereal, lined the marble corridors. Chloe Vance stepped out of the black car, her heels clicking against the gravel with a rhythmic, predatory precision. She wasn't wearing the modest scrubs of a surgical resident tonight. Instead, she wore a column of midnight blue silk that moved like deep water, a garment that cost more than Beatrice would ever believe she could afford. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of expensive wax and the metallic tang of vintage champagne. Beatrice Sterling stood at the center of the room, a diamond-encrusted vulture holding court. She was draped in heirloom emeralds, her laughter sharp and performative as she gestured toward a group of stone-faced men in tailored suits. These were the board members, the gatekeepers of the Sterling legacy, and tonight, Beatrice intended to convince them that her leadership was the only thing keeping the family empire from crumbling. "There she is," Beatrice said, her voice carrying over the soft strains of the string quartet as Chloe approached. The socialites surrounding the matriarch turned, their eyes scanning Chloe with practiced disdain. Beatrice didn't wait for a greeting. She stepped forward, her hand darting out to adjust the collar of Chloe's dress with a proprietary, mocking flick. "I suppose even a hospital worker can scrub up for one night, though I'm surprised you found the nerve to show up after our little chat yesterday. I thought I made it clear that your presence was no longer required in this family." Chloe didn't flinch. She met the older woman's gaze with a terrifyingly calm smile. "I wouldn't miss this for the world, Beatrice. Tonight is a turning point for everyone in this room." "It certainly is," Beatrice sneered, leaning in close so only Chloe could smell the gin on her breath. "By tomorrow morning, Julian will be tucked away in a private clinic for his recovery, and you will be a footnote in a divorce settlement. I've already had your things moved to the service entrance. Don't overstay your welcome." Chloe watched her walk away, her fingers grazing the small, cold weight of the encrypted flash drive tucked into her clutch. She scanned the room, spotting Julian Sterling standing near the tall French doors. He looked like a ghost of the man she had married, his eyes glazed and his posture slumped. Beatrice had clearly increased his medication for the evening to ensure he remained a compliant prop. Marcus Sterling stood a few feet behind his brother, his expression tight. When his eyes met Chloe's, he gave a single, imperceptible nod. The medical records were secured. The blood tests, showing the sedatives in Julian's system, were already in Sarah's hands. A hand touched Chloe's elbow. She turned to find Elena Thorne standing there, her usual mask of high society boredom replaced by a flicker of genuine unease. Elena's eyes darted from Chloe's expensive silk to the confident set of her shoulders. "You look different tonight, Chloe," Elena whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "There's a rumor going around the board members, something about a hostile takeover from an outside firm, Vance Holding. Do you know anything about it?" "I know that the world is much smaller than Beatrice thinks it is, Elena," Chloe replied, her voice smooth as glass. "You might want to think about where you're standing when the floor starts to move." Elena paled, her grip tightening on her crystal flute. She looked toward Beatrice, then back at Chloe, the gears of social survival turning behind her eyes. Before she could respond, the chime of a silver spoon against a glass rang through the ballroom. Beatrice had moved to the small dais at the head of the room. She looked radiant, the light from the chandeliers catching the sharp angles of her face. "Ladies and gentlemen, members of the board," she began, her voice projecting the effortless authority she had spent 40 years perfecting. "Tonight, we celebrate the enduring strength of the Sterling name. Despite recent, domestic distractions, our expansion into the European markets is proceeding as planned. We are a family of legacy, of ironclad stability. Chloe moved through the crowd, positioning herself near the front of the dais. She could see Sarah Jenkins standing by the heavy oak doors of the study, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Sarah, the legal blade Chloe had honed over years of secret planning, looked ready to strike. However, Beatrice continued, her eyes landing on Chloe with a glimmer of triumphant malice, stability requires the removal of any element that threatens the core. To that end, I will be signing the final restructuring documents tonight, ensuring the Sterling estate remains under my sole direction for the next decade. A murmur of approval rippled through the sycophants, but the board members remained silent, their eyes shifting toward the back of the room. A tall, gray-haired man Chloe recognized as the head of the board leaned toward his colleague. The air in the room suddenly felt electric, the atmospheric pressure dropping as the wait-for-it moment arrived. Chloe checked her watch. It was 9:00 p.m. The wire transfer from Vance Holding had cleared 10 minutes ago. Every debt Beatrice had hidden, every loan she had taken out against the estate to fund her lifestyle, now sat on Chloe's balance sheet. Beatrice gestured for a waiter to bring over the documents. "Julian, darling, come stand by your mother," she commanded. Julian moved forward like a marionette, his face blank. Beatrice picked up a fountain pen, her signature poised to finalize her reign. "I wouldn't sign that if I were you, Beatrice," Chloe said. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. The quartet stopped playing. The whispers died in an instant. Beatrice paused, the pen hovering over the paper, her face contorting into a mask of pure, indignant rage. "You've had your fun, Chloe," Beatrice hissed, her voice shaking with the effort of maintaining her public facade. "Security, please escort this woman out. She's clearly had too much to drink." 2 security guards moved forward, but they stopped when Sarah Jenkins stepped into the light, holding a thick stack of legal papers embossed with a seal that made the board members visibly stiffen. "She's not going anywhere," Sarah said, her voice ringing with professional authority. "And those documents in front of you are worthless. You can't restructure an estate you no longer own." Beatrice let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, looking around at her guests for support. "No longer own. I'm a Sterling. This house, this land, the very air you're breathing belongs to me." Chloe stepped onto the first tier of the dais, looking down at the woman who had spent years trying to break her. The sleeping lion was no longer hiding. "The Sterling estate was leveraged to the hilt, Beatrice. You spent the legacy on hush money and bad investments. Those debts were purchased 48 hours ago by Vance Holding." Chloe leaned in, her voice a cold, clear whisper that seemed to echo in the sudden, deafening silence of the ballroom. "And I am Vance Holding." Beatrice's hand began to shake, the fountain pen slipping from her fingers and clattering onto the marble floor. The color began to drain from her face, leaving her skin looking like yellowed parchment. She looked toward the board members, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a lie big enough to save her. But the board members weren't looking at her anymore. They were looking at Chloe. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer respectful. It was heavy, a suffocating weight that pressed against the lungs of every socialite and board member in the room. Chloe Vance stood perfectly still, her hand resting on the podium. She could feel the cool, brushed metal of the remote in her palm, a small plastic trigger that held the power to dismantle a 40-year dynasty. Beatrice Sterling let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. It was a jagged, ugly noise that cut through the stillness. She clutched the edge of the dais, her knuckles white against the dark wood. "You're delusional," she hissed, her voice trembling with a frantic, desperate edge. "You're a surgical resident, a charity case Julian brought home because he felt sorry for you. You don't have the capital to buy a grocery store, let alone the Sterling debt." Chloe didn't argue. She didn't need to. She simply pressed the button. The massive projector screen behind them hummed to life, the blue light casting long, ghostly shadows across the marble floor. A document appeared, crisp and undeniable. It was the Vance holding articles of incorporation, followed immediately by a notarized deed of transfer for the Sterling estate. At the bottom, in bold, black ink, was Chloe's signature. The room erupted into a low, frantic hum of whispers. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward from the shadows of the wings, her sharp, tailored suit a stark contrast to the flowing evening gowns around her. She held a leather portfolio like a shield. She didn't say a word, but the way she stood, shoulders back, gaze fixed on the board members, told everyone exactly who had executed the kill. Beatrice's face began to undergo a terrifying transformation. The skin around her eyes tightened, then sagged, as if the very muscles holding her together had simply given up. A frantic, rhythmic twitch started at the corner of her left eyelid, and her complexion shifted from a pale, sickly yellow to a mottled, bruised purple. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out, just the faint, wet click of her teeth. She looked smaller, her expensive silk gown suddenly appearing 2 sizes too large for her shrinking frame. "This is a forgery," Beatrice finally croaked, though her eyes were darting toward the exit. "Julian, tell them she's lying." Julian Sterling sat in the front row, his head bowed. He looked like a man waking from a long, feverish dream. Beside him, Marcus Sterling placed a steadying hand on his brother's shoulder. Marcus looked up at Chloe, a grim, silent nod of validation passing between them. He had spent months helping her track the offshore accounts Beatrice had used to hide her embezzlement, and seeing the proof on the screen was the only medicine Julian truly needed. The social tide turned with a visceral, audible shift. Elena Thorne, who had been Beatrice's closest confidant and chief enabler for 2 decades, took a deliberate, audible step backward. Her heels clicked against the marble like a gavel. She smoothed her skirt, her gaze shifting toward the buffet table as if she'd never met the woman on the dais. 2 other board members followed suit, physically distancing themselves from Beatrice as if her ruin were contagious. "It's not just the house, Beatrice," Chloe said, her voice dropping to a cold, clear whisper that carried to the back of the hall. She clicked the remote again. A new set of documents appeared: medical records, toxicology reports, and pharmacy logs. The room went deathly quiet as the words "unauthorized sedative administration" and Julian Sterling flashed in high definition. "You didn't just spend the family legacy on hush money for your scandals," Chloe continued, stepping off the dais and descending the stairs toward the woman who had spent years trying to break her. "You drugged your own son to keep him from realizing you were bankrupting his future. You turned him into a ghost so you could keep playing the queen." Beatrice's hand flew to her throat, clutching her pearls so hard the strings snapped. The white spheres cascaded to the floor, bouncing and skittering across the marble like tiny, panicked animals. She looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face, but she found only the cold, voyeuristic judgment of the people she had spent her life trying to impress. Chloe reached the bottom step and stopped. She didn't look angry. She looked finished. "The security team is waiting in the foyer, Beatrice. They have your personal items in a cardboard box. You have 10 minutes to leave this property before you're trespassed from your own party." Chloe turned her back on the wreckage. She didn't wait to see the tears or the inevitable screaming match. She walked toward Julian and Marcus, the sound of her steady footsteps the only thing left of the Sterling grace. Behind her, the first sob of a fallen queen echoed through the hall, but Chloe didn't look back. She had a husband to wake up and a legacy to rebuild. The silence in the grand foyer was absolute, heavy with the scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of spilled champagne. Beatrice Sterling stood frozen at the base of the marble staircase, her hand clutching the banister so hard her knuckles looked like polished bone. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked like a cornered animal, her chest heaving beneath her silk gown. "You're delusional," she hissed, her voice cracking as she looked at the silent crowd. "This is my house. I am a Sterling. You are nothing but a surgical resident I allowed into my family out of pity." Chloe Vance didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the hall, her posture a stark contrast to the frantic energy radiating from the older woman. The secret weight she had carried for years, the knowledge of her own family's legacy and the sheer power of Vance Holdings, felt light now. It was no longer a burden, it was a blade. "You were never a Sterling by blood, Beatrice," Chloe said, her voice low and steady, carrying easily to the back of the room. "You were a wife who outlived a man and then spent 20 years poisoning his sons to keep his seat warm. But the seat doesn't belong to you. It never did." A sharp click of heels echoed against the marble. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward from the shadows of the arched doorway, clutching a slim, black leather folder. She wasn't dressed for a party. She wore a charcoal power suit that made the socialites in their sequins look like children playing dress-up. "As the primary legal counsel for Vance Holdings," Sarah announced, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the guests, "I am here to serve the formal eviction and asset freeze. The Sterling estate, including all offshore accounts and the physical property known as Sterling Manor, was acquired by my client 3 months ago. Your signature on the emergency loan documents last spring effectively collateralized your entire life." Beatrice's face underwent a transformation that was almost tectonic. The carefully curated mask of the matriarch didn't just crack, it dissolved. Her skin, usually porcelain and taut from decades of expensive procedures, seemed to lose its structural integrity. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a sallow, grayish hue that made her look every day of her 60 years. Her left eyelid developed a frantic, rhythmic twitch, a sharp contrast to the glazed, uncomprehending stare of her pupils. Her mouth, which had launched 1,000 insults, hung slightly agape, the lower lip trembling with a silent, pathetic vibration. It was the look of a woman who had spent her life building a fortress of lies, only to realize the foundation was made of nothing but salt and air. She turned to her oldest friend, searching for a lifeline. "Elena, tell them. Tell them this is a mistake." Elena Thorne didn't step forward. Instead, she took a deliberate, slow step backward, her silk skirts rustling in the quiet room. She adjusted her pearls, her gaze shifting from Beatrice to Chloe with the cold, calculating speed of a predator choosing a new pack leader. "I think the documents speak for themselves, darling," she murmured, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. "It would be quite scandalous to be caught on the wrong side of a trespass order." The betrayal hit the room like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. Marcus Sterling stood by the piano, his arms crossed, watching his mother's collapse with a grim, hollow satisfaction. He didn't look happy, but he looked free. "Julian," Beatrice gasped, her voice a ragged plea as she reached out toward her other son. "Julian, tell her to stop. You're my son. I did everything for you." She lunged forward, trying to grab his arm, her manicured nails catching on his sleeve. It was a final, desperate attempt at the gaslighting that had kept him tethered to her for years. But Julian didn't move toward her. He stepped back, his eyes clear for the first time in months, the fog of the vitamins she had forced upon him finally lifting. He looked at her not with love, but with a profound, quiet pity. "You didn't do it for me," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "You did it so you wouldn't have to be alone in a house you didn't own. It's over, Mother." Chloe felt a surge of cold pride for him, but she didn't let it soften her expression. She reached into Sarah's folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was the original deed, stamped and sealed, bearing the Vance family crest. 10 minutes, Beatrice," Chloe repeated. Her voice was ice, devoid of the rage that had fueled her for so long. Rage was for the weak. This was simply surgery. She was cutting out the rot. "The security team will assist you with 1 suitcase. Anything else, the jewelry, the furs, the sterling silver, stays. It was bought with money you embezzled from your son's trust funds. It belongs to the estate now." Beatrice let out a sound that wasn't a sob or a scream, but a high, thin wail of pure ego death. She looked around the room, but the guests were already turning away, their phones out, capturing the fall of the woman they had feared an hour ago. They were already gossiping about the Vance name, wondering how they had missed the lioness in their midst. Chloe turned her back on the wreckage. She didn't need to watch the security guards escort the former queen through the front doors. She didn't need to hear the final, shrill demands for a lawyer. She walked toward the grand entrance, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat on the marble that now legally belonged to her. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she paused and looked at the butler, who stood trembling by the coat rack. "Ensure the locks are changed by midnight," she said calmly. "And call the hospital. Tell them Dr. Vance will be in for her shift tomorrow morning. I have a legacy to actually earn." She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy doors thudding shut behind her with a sound of finality that echoed through the valley. The lights of the manor stayed on, but for the first time in 20 years, the shadows inside were gone. Chloe walked toward her modest car, the deed tucked under her arm. She had won the house, the name, and the war. But as she looked back at the glowing windows, a new question chilled her blood. She had dismantled the Sterling matriarchy, but the records Sarah had found in the safe hinted at something much darker than simple embezzlement. Beatrice hadn't just been stealing money. She had been paying someone to keep a very specific secret about Chloe's own father. The war wasn't over. It was just changing fronts. 6 months had passed since the heavy iron gates of the Sterling estate had swung shut behind Beatrice Sterling for the last time. Chloe Vance stood in the center of the newly christened Vance Research Wing, the scent of fresh white paint and sterile lemon cleaner hanging in the air. It was a sharp, clinical contrast to the cloying, heavy jasmine perfume that had once choked the halls of the manor. She adjusted her white coat, feeling the weight of the embroidered name over her heart. It didn't just say doctor. It represented a lineage that had been restored. Beside her, Sarah Jenkins tapped a rhythmic beat against a leather-bound folder. The lawyer looked sharper than ever, her eyes scanning the room with the predatory satisfaction of a hunter who had finally cleared the woods of its wolves. "The final audit is complete," Sarah said, her voice echoing off the high-tech glass partitions. "The embezzlement Beatrice funneled through the overseas accounts has been fully recovered. Every cent she stole from your father's original patent has been funneled back into this foundation. It's official, Chloe. The Sterling name is a footnote. The Vance legacy is the headline." Chloe ran a hand over the cool surface of a stainless steel lab bench. It was a victory, yet the silence of the room felt heavy. She thought of Julian Sterling. He wasn't the man she had married anymore. The years of subtle drugging and psychological erosion had left him with a fractured memory and a long road of rehabilitation ahead. They spoke once a week, but the conversations were polite, distant, and filled with the ghosts of a life Beatrice had systematically dismantled. He was recovering in a quiet facility upstate, finally free of the fog, but the cost of that freedom was the intimacy they could never quite reclaim. "And what about her?" Chloe asked, her voice low. Sarah pulled a small, candid photograph from the folder and slid it across the bench. "Elena Thorne sent this yesterday. She couldn't resist a final bit of social scavenging." Chloe looked at the image. It was a grainy shot taken from a distance in a public park. Beatrice sat on a weathered wooden bench, wearing a coat that was 2 seasons out of style and noticeably frayed at the cuffs. Gone were the diamonds and the meticulously coiffed hair. She looked smaller, her posture stooped as she clutched a plastic bag containing a few meager groceries. There were no servants to command, no board members to intimidate. She was just an elderly woman in a beige world, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the very district she used to call the gutter. The most striking detail was the expression on her face, a mask of profound, bewildered bitterness. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. The high society friends like Elena had vanished the moment the bank accounts froze, moving on to the next power player like heat-seeking missiles. Beatrice was a social leper, a cautionary tale whispered over mimosas at the clubs she was no longer allowed to enter. "She tried to call the hospital board last week," Sarah added, a cold smirk playing on her lips. "She wanted to complain about the lack of respect she received at the local pharmacy when her credit card was declined. The secretary didn't even recognize her name. She had to wait in line like everyone else." Chloe felt a flicker of the old rage, but it was quickly extinguished by a profound sense of peace. The face slap hadn't been a single blow. It was the slow, agonizing realization for Beatrice that she was irrelevant. For a woman who defined her existence by the power she held over others, being ignored was a fate worse than prison. Later that afternoon, Marcus Sterling joined Chloe on the balcony overlooking the city. He looked younger, the stress that had lined his face for years finally beginning to fade. He had taken over the legitimate side of the family's holdings, stripping away the corruption Beatrice had sewn into the fabric of the company. "I found the last of it," Marcus said, handing Chloe a yellowed, handwritten letter. "It was tucked behind a false panel in the study. It's from your father, written weeks before his accident." He knew she was coming for the patent. He knew she was poisoning the well. Chloe unfolded the paper, her breath catching as she recognized the steady, familiar script. Her father hadn't been a victim of his own weakness. He had been a man fighting a silent war to protect his daughter's future. He had hidden the true ownership of the Vance holdings in a trust that Beatrice could never touch, a seed that had waited 20 years for Chloe to water it. "He knew you'd be the one to finish it," Marcus whispered. Chloe looked out at the skyline, the sun dipping below the horizon and painting the clouds in bruised purples and golds. She had won the house, the money, and the name, but she had lost her father, her husband's youth, and the girl she had been before the Sterlings had tried to break her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver key, the key to the Sterling Manor's front door. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed it over the railing. She watched it fall, a tiny glint of light disappearing into the shadows of the city below. The war was over. The shadows were gone. But as she turned back toward the bright, humming lights of the research wing, Chloe knew that the cost of justice was a weight she would carry forever. She walked toward the elevators, the sound of her own steady footsteps the only legacy she needed.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.